Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 73 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have won 4-0. And with this victory, the Sharks have prevented themselves from getting yet another 10-game losing streak on the year. It would have been their third one this season, but it instead comes to an end at 9. And with the fact that there are only 9 games remaining on the schedule this season, they won't have another opportunity there. So I guess technically that's a bit of good news. On top of that, this was a pretty interesting matchup between these two teams, the Sharks and the Blues, because the Blues are one of the very few teams in the NHL this season who haven't yet beat the Sharks. This is primarily due to the fact that they've only played a single game this season, and in that one, the Sharks actually had one of their better performances of the year, and as such really took it to St. Louis in that game with a victory 5-1. And so here tonight in this game, it was a chance for the Blues to get some revenge against the league's literal worst team. On top of that, while the Blues are kind of far out of the playoff race, they are technically still in it. I imagine the coach is still trying to rally that group together to say, hey, if we go on a 10-game winning streak to end this year, we could still technically make the playoffs with 100 points or something like that. So there is still an option there, and this would probably be one of their easiest remaining games on the schedule, and yet even though the Blues were on home ice, the Sharks once again embarrassed them with this victory 4-0. So for whatever reason, the Sharks seem to have the Blues number, pretty much the only team that they have the number of so far this season. However, this first period did not start off particularly well for San Jose. In fact, it was very similar to the one of the previous game against the Minnesota Wild. While it was a slight improvement in the fact that the Sharks didn't only get a single shot in that first period, it was pretty much entirely Blues control. And they had such an easy time getting these high danger opportunities. The amount of rush chances that the Sharks defensemen were just completely out of position for. It wasn't even a situation where they were pinching too aggressively in the offensive zone, creating a 2-on-1, or maybe a defense or a forward wasn't necessarily getting back to fill in for a defenseman who was forechecking in deep or anything of that nature. It was just terrible positioning in the neutral zone that just created so much open ice for these Blues forward. There was a stretch of time, like a good 2-3 minutes, in which the Blues got 3 or 4 rush chances so easily from San Jose, and it could have definitely been a 1-0, 2-0, maybe even 3-0 lead for St. Louis at the end of the first period, if not for the heroics of Sharks goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. He had already put up a pretty good performance in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild, and here tonight he was even better than that, standing on his head for San Jose and allowing this game to remain tied at the end of 20 minutes. In the second period, yet again, like how it went with Minnesota, the Sharks definitely began to wake up, began to start making some plays, but the major difference here tonight and why the goals managed to pile up a bit more than in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild is primarily due to some pretty good bounces for the San Jose Sharks. Zadina getting a bit of a good bounce, but also a nice little play from him to create a takeaway for himself, score this goal to make it 1-0 San Jose. Then it is a nice little executed rush play, good pass from Eklund in the neutral zone, finds Zetterlund, or finds Granlund, give and take between him. Granlund smart to hang around the net to get that second opportunity, something that the Sharks have not been doing much of, and he scores one of these dirty types of goals is what you might describe this as. So the Sharks with the 2-0 lead, and then after that another good bounce, good opportunity as Cunnin is the benefactor of that, scores to make it 3-0 San Jose, and that is the score at the end of the second period. In the third period, things kind of revert back a bit. The Sharks clearly on their heels, attempting to hold on to this lead against a St. Louis Blues team who at least wants to score a single goal, and while they would hit a post here or there, Blackwood would stand tall and prevent the Blues from getting even a single goal in this game, giving the Sharks and Blackwood himself their second shutout of the season. Eventually, Jan Rutta would even add an empty netter as the Blues would go pretty aggressively, pulling the goaltender with 3 goals down, something that you don't usually see at the NHL level, at least not during the regular season, and as such, the Sharks win this game 4-0. Moving on to the players to talk about, the same lineup pretty much throughout for San Jose, a top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Kostin. This line wasn't together the entirety of the night. There was a moment in which Kostin took a pretty undisciplined slashing penalty that David Quinn very clearly wasn't a fan of. I'm not entirely sure how long the sort of demotion, so to speak, lasted, but Kostin and Eklund actually swapped spots as Kostin dropped to the second and Eklund rose to the first line for at least a few shifts before things seemed to revert back to normal at some point in the third period. When it comes to how these players actually performed here tonight, well, Good news, obviously, Granlund manages to score, and I'd say generally they were better than how they were performing in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild. But the major thing here tonight for San Jose is that they were extremely opportunistic. In the first period, they had pretty much zero chances, and in the third period, you could say the same thing, although at least at that time, you could understand why they were defending more compared to in the first period where they were simply just getting outplayed. And even in the second period where you could make the argument that the Sharks were the better team, a lot of their chances were coming off of strong opportunistic rush chances and not so much off of crazy offensive zone time. If you take a look at the Zadina and the Cunnin goal, these are from the zone, not necessarily rush, but mostly just Blues mistakes compared to the Sharks really making things happen. And so when it comes to this first line, I would say it was a good performance, but nothing fantastic, nothing great, nothing particularly stand out. When it comes to the second line of Eklund, Cunnin, and Bailey, if there's one thing to be said here is that I thought this was the only line in the first period that actually managed to get something rolling. It was not really notable all that much, but Eklund in particular at least showed off his speed a couple of times, making a couple of slick plays in that opening frame. As the game wore on and the Sharks sort of picked it up a bit, this line ended up kind of falling back into the crowd, I would say, where they didn't exactly get to do a ton. Bailey, not really super apparent. Cunnin, he gets that goal, which is quite nice, actually in front of his family here, as he is from the St. Louis area, so that was cool to see. And then the time where Kostin got moved down to the second line, they didn't really do much. Once Eklund was reunited, they looked okay. Generally, a decent game for the second line. When it comes to the third line, this was actually slightly disappointing. I've been extremely happy with Bordeleau's performances since he's been called up. Pretty much every single game that he has played, he's been one of the Sharks' better forwards. That is until tonight, where in fact it has flipped the opposite way, where Bordeleau was actually one of the least effective forwards for the San Jose Sharks. This is not to say that he was bad here tonight, and he was definitely not a liability. His defensive game, not ever really going to be all that fantastic, but it certainly wasn't terrible here tonight. But on the offensive side of things, where Bordeleau has still managed to look really, really good, he had one good offensive chance where I thought he made a couple of good plays on this particular shift, but it didn't really carry over through much of this game. Found himself playing a good amount in the defensive zone, couldn't really manufacture any solid plays through the neutral zone either, so generally one of his lower impact games since being called up. When it comes to the two other players here, Mike Hoffman, I don't really know if he's a great fit on this third line. I mentioned it in the previous one where he seemed to have struggles at first, really meshing well with Sturm and Bordeleau, but as the game wore on, it ended up being a bit more okay. Here tonight, though, it just felt as though he was kind of the odd man out a bit, and I'm not a huge fan of what Mike Hoffman has been doing as of late since returning, which is really only a couple of games. When it comes to Nico Sturm, on the other hand, at the very least, because this was a game that was filled with the Sharks having to play well defensively in front of their goaltender, Nico Sturm, that's exactly the area he excels at. And so while Bordeleau, I said, had a pretty low impact game because, his defensive game isn't necessarily going to shine, Nico Sturm, I thought, was quite effective on that side of the ice. When it comes to then the fourth line, we have Carpenter with LeBanc and Zadina. Nice to see Zadina break through here. He has moved quickly from the top parts of the lineup down to the fourth line here for San Jose. As I mentioned in the previous review, he had the least amount of ice time in that game against the Minnesota Wild. So clearly David Quinn is sort of reflecting how Zadina has played as of late. So definitely quite nice to see him get this goal. It's going to be interesting what the Sharks actually decide to do with Filip Zadina at the end of this season. Will they give him another contract? I would suspect yes, but of course you never know what Mike Greer's plans actually are. So good game for Zadina. When it comes to the other two players, and in particular Kevin LeBanc, not a ton really happening when it comes to the fourth line. They did have a couple of good shifts, so don't get me wrong, don't want to discount their performance there, but it wasn't necessarily super high octane all the time. But from a fourth line, I guess this is as good as you might expect. When it comes defensively, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows, and as I have mentioned many, many times, their play flows with how the Sharks are doing. With the fact that they managed to let in just 0 goals this game, these two players, and the fact that they were on the ice a good amount of time, actually played rather well. I'd like to see the increased ability of actually being able to actively pressure Blues players when they're down low near the goal line and along the boards to actually be able to clear this puck out of the zone. A lot of the times these two defensemen are relying more so on their forwards to make the plays of actually getting the puck out, and more so these two are just sort of covering their bases and playing very, very conservatively in their own zone. This is primarily due to the fact as well that they find themselves on the ice for extremely long shifts, which means they don't necessarily have the energy to make those types of plays, but I'd like to see them be able to go that extra mile and actually push the pace forward out of the zone instead of having to rely on the help from their wingers and their centermen here. But generally, I still thought a pretty good game for both Ferraro and Burrows. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Thrun and Addison were united together at the pretty much the early point of last game against the Minnesota Wild, and that pairing was remaining the same here tonight. And I don't know if they struck a bit of magic here, but for whatever reason, these two players who had been struggling as of late over these last couple of months have suddenly complemented themselves rather well, which is not something that I would have expected. I thought playing Thrun with a more defensively responsible Jan Ruda would be significantly better for him, and for much of this season it was, and that putting him with an extremely inexperienced and not very good defenseman in Calen Addison would be a disaster for San Jose, and that this would be a terrible, very porous defensive pairing. But it has been quite the opposite, where suddenly these two players have actually looked pretty decent, getting a okay amount of ice time for sure, not finding themselves having to play too much in the defensive zone. When they do, they're able to actually clear the puck rather well, probably the best out of any of these three defensive pairings, so a good game for both of these players. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, they were terrible in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild. Here tonight, definitely a bit of redemption. Jan Ruda in particular, I thought, had a definitely better game than the last couple of ones. He needed absolutely to be much better. I mentioned how I even called him out in the way that as a veteran player, he can't have such terrible games multiple times in a row. Here tonight, redeems himself. It wasn't outstanding. Definitely one of the weaker defensive pairings on the night for San Jose, but still an improvement. And then finally, we have the goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. As I said, a fantastic night for him, his second shutout of the season. He has been steadily improving since returning from his injury. He was quite bad right out of the gate, but in these last couple of games, much, much better. And we can only hope that he can finish this season off well for San Jose to be able to carry this type of performance into next year. Remember, it is likely that the Sharks will still be in a rebuilding phase next year, that they're still not going to be the best of the best teams. And by that time, Blackwood will have 1 year remaining on his contract. Teams are always still looking for some goaltending help heading into the playoffs. Maybe Blackwood could be an option then, as long as he's able to carry this level of performance forward. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will be taking on the Seattle Kraken. Funnily enough, the one other team that the Sharks have actually shut out this season is this very same Seattle Kraken squad. So an opportunity for San Jose to even set a winning streak together for them. Might not be the best thing for the Sharks as an organization, considering they do want to keep a lockdown on that last place spot, but you never know what can happen. Class dismissed.